The fundamental building blocks of nature are fluid-like substances which are spread throughout the entire universe and ripple in strange and interesting ways. That's the fundamental reality in which we live. These fluid-like substances, we call them fields.
Most people think reality responds to effort. They try harder, they plan more, they push longer, and somehow, nothing really changes. Not because they're doing it wrong, but because they're operating from a misunderstanding. Reality doesn't reorganize around intensity. It reorganizes around coherence. When your thoughts say one thing, your emotions expect another, and your actions hedge somewhere in between, the signal becomes noisy. Not weak, noisy. Neuroscience shows that internal conflict fragments perception and decision-making. Psychology shows that environments respond to patterns, not intentions. So when people say the quantum field isn't responding, what they're really experiencing is feedback, not punishment, not delay, feedback. The shift doesn't happen when you force certainty. It happens when the internal argument stops. And once that clicks, everything else starts to move. Quietly, but decisively. When I started looking more closely at why effort fails so often, the pattern wasn't laziness or lack of discipline. It was internal contradiction. Moving from force to flow. What stood out to me, after tracing this across psychology and behavioral research, was how often logic is used not to clarify, but to avoid uncertainty. This is where most people go wrong. They assume the answer is more effort, so they tighten their schedules, refine their plans, double down on logic. But effort applied from internal contradiction doesn't create momentum, it creates drag. In cognitive science, this is described as increased cognitive load. When the mind is split, wanting one outcome while emotionally preparing for another, attention fragments. Timing worsens, decisions slow down, intuition goes quiet. From the outside, it looks like discipline. Internally, it's tension. This is why so many people feel exhausted without being effective. The shift from force to flow isn't about doing less. It's about removing internal interference. Reality is less like something you have to build and more like a signal that already exists. A radio station doesn't appear because you turn the dial harder. It becomes clear when the static drops. Flow begins when effort relaxes without disengagement, when attention becomes present instead of urgent, when action is guided by clarity, not pressure. That's when timing improves. That's when intuition returns. That's when movement stops feeling forced. Not because you stopped trying, but because you stopped fighting yourself. The power of internal coherence. Once effort stops fighting itself, something more important comes into focus. Coherence. Coherence isn't positivity, it's consistency. When thoughts point in one direction, emotions pull in another, and actions hesitate somewhere in between. The system produces noise, not failure. Noise. Neuroscience shows that emotional incongruence disrupts perception and judgment. The brain treats internal contradiction as instability. Attention narrows. Threat sensitivity increases. The future feels uncertain, even when it isn't. This is why people say they want change while emotionally preparing for disappointment. The intention says yes, the body braces for no. That contradiction doesn't stop movement completely. It creates half movements. Opportunities arrive, but they're unclear. Momentum starts, then fades. Progress feels fragile instead of solid. Coherence isn't about feeling good all the time. It's about being honest without resistance. When fear can exist without negotiation, when desire isn't immediately followed by self-protection, the signal simplifies. And when the signal simplifies, reality becomes easier to move through. Not because it changed, but because perception did. The trap of logic and control. This is where logic quietly becomes a problem. Not because logic is wrong, but because it's often misused. Logic is excellent for organizing information. It's terrible at replacing trust. Many people use logic as a shield. If they can plan enough, predict enough, understand enough, they won't have to feel uncertainty. But uncertainty isn't eliminated by control. It's postponed. Psychology calls this uncertainty avoidance. Structure is used to reduce discomfort, not to see clearly. Trying to control reality through logic is like gripping water with your fist. The tighter the grip, the less remains. Control wants one guaranteed path. Clarity allows multiple possibilities. Clarity doesn't demand certainty before movement. It responds to what's available now. This is why over-planning often kills momentum. Not because planning is bad, but because it locks perception into a narrow frame. When logic softens into clarity, something shifts. You don't know everything, but you know enough to move, and that's all coherence ever required. Overcoming conditioning and doubt. Doubt is often misunderstood. It's treated as intuition, as wisdom, as a warning sign. But most doubt isn't instinctual, it's conditioned. From early on, people are trained to look outward for permission, approval, validation, proof that it's safe to move. Over time, hesitation becomes automatic. Psychology describes this as learned inhibition. Self-trust becomes associated with risk. Doubt doesn't stop movement, it fragments it. You step forward, then pull back. You commit, then keep an exit open. And reality mirrors that hesitation, not as punishment, as feedback. What looks like the field not responding is often the environment reflecting an unresolved internal stance. Certainty doesn't come from eliminating doubt, it comes from removing doubt's authority. Peace as an active signal. Most people think peace arrives after things work out, but peace is not the result, it's the condition. Physiologically, peace is a regulated nervous system. When the body isn't bracing for threat, perception widens. Choices become flexible. Reactions slow down enough to become responses. Living in constant low-grade tension, the sense of being behind or needing to rush, signals instability. Not to the universe, to your own system. Stress narrows focus. Urgency distorts judgment. Action becomes reactive. Peace doesn't mean fear disappears. It means fear no longer drives. You can feel uncertainty without obeying it. You can feel doubt without negotiating with it. And when action comes from that state, it's steady, not loud, not forced, just coherent. The test before the shift. Just before a real change stabilizes, friction often appears. Old patterns resurface. Doubts get louder. Situations you thought were finished return. This isn't failure. Behavioral psychology shows that when a new internal stance forms, the system briefly defaults to what's familiar. Not because it's correct, because it's known. Change introduces uncertainty, and the system checks for safety. This moment feels like a test. In reviewing patterns of behavioral change, this was the moment that kept repeating. The point where old reactions briefly return right before a new stance stabilizes. Not a cosmic one, a stability check. Will you return to old reactions, or will you stay consistent under pressure? If the stance collapses, the signal destabilizes. And reality reflects that inconsistency. But when the stance holds, something reorganizes, quietly. Decisions simplify, responses clean up, old loops lose energy. This is where most people stop. Not because the change wasn't working, but because it was, acting from understanding. The final shift doesn't announce itself. It happens when movement stops waiting for permission. Waiting often looks patient, but underneath, it's usually a lack of self-trust. The belief that clarity should come first, that reality should confirm you. But understanding moves in the opposite direction. When action comes from coherence, it doesn't feel rushed or dramatic. It feels obvious, grounded, almost ordinary. This is the moment you stop observing your life and start participating in it, not to force outcomes, but because the internal stance is no longer divided. This is what people mean when they say the quantum field responds, not because reality is watching you, but because who you are being has stabilized. Perception clears, decisions simplify, movement aligns. The field doesn't respond to effort, it responds when the signal stops contradicting itself. And once that happens, reality doesn't need to be pushed, it meets you where you stand.